Late afternoon clouds hung low over Portland, Oregon, a city that seemed to hold its breath every time the rain paused. In a quiet neighborhood on the east side of town, Evelyn Hart, 55, lived in a two-bedroom townhouse that looked perfectly ordinary from the outside. Fresh white porch railings, neatly trimmed shrubs, a wind chime whispering whenever the breeze pushed through. But anyone who had stepped inside over the years would have felt something colder than the Oregon winter walls, a silence so thick it clung to the furniture, a loneliness that never left the room no matter how many lamps Evelyn kept lit. Evelyn had once been known as a sharp, efficient office manager at a mid-size architectural firm downtown. People admired her for staying afloat after her husband walked out 15 years earlier, disappearing with a co-worker he later married. She never spoke badly of him, never raised her voice, never missed a day of work. But the quiet, steady woman the world saw was only the outer shell. Inside, something in her had cracked the night he left, something that never sealed again. Her son, Caleb Hart, had only been 6 at the time. He remembered his father's duffel bag, the slammed door, the sound of his mother's breath catching like she was swallowing glass. From that day, his world shrank to one person, her. And for Evelyn, the boy became more than a son, became the last proof that she hadn't been abandoned entirely. For years, everything in Evelyn's life orbited around Caleb. She walked him to school until he was nearly in middle school, waited in the car outside every after-school activity, rejected every offer to let him stay at a friend's house. At first, people thought she was simply an overprotective single mom. But as Caleb grew older, the rules tightened instead of loosening. By the time he was 15, he wasn't allowed to spend time at other houses, wasn't allowed to keep his bedroom door locked, wasn't allowed to have social media unless she had full access. At first Caleb resisted quietly. He would turn off location tracking, delete a few messages before handing over his phone, pretend he had group projects just to stay at school later. But Evelyn always found out. Not because she searched aggressively, but because she watched him with unnerving precision the way other people watched the clock. Nothing slipped by her. A change in tone, a longer pause before answering, a backpack slightly heavier than usual. She read every sign like a trained interrogator. When she sensed he was pulling away, her demeanor shifted. She didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She simply told stories about the night his father left, about sitting alone in the kitchen hearing her own heartbeat echo in an empty house, about how Caleb was the only reason she survived that darkness. She would end every story with the same soft sentence. "You re all I have, sweetheart. Don't drift away from me too." To a child, that sentence sounded like love. To a teenager, it felt like a chain. By the time Caleb entered his senior year of high school, people began to notice changes, subtle at first. He showed up to class exhausted, avoided eye contact, spoke less than he used to. His art teachers said he had talent, a gift for interior design and spatial drawing, but the spark behind his ambitions grew dimmer each month. He stopped applying for scholarships. Stopped talking about college visits. Stopped eating lunch with friends altogether. His classmates whispered theories: breakup, depression, family problems, but none of them came close to the truth. She insisted on seeing his grades before he did. She checked his email, his calendar, even his private drafts. She installed security cameras inside the house under the excuse of safety. She dictated what he wore, what time he slept, what part-time jobs he could take. None. Her justification for every extreme rule was always the same. "I'm protecting you. The world out there doesn't care what happens to us. But I do." The deeper truth was darker. Evelyn wasn't protecting Caleb from the world, she was protecting herself from the fear of being alone again. Caleb felt it. He felt it in the way she stared at him too long, in how she talked in circles about losing him, in how she hovered in his doorway at night pretending to check the thermostat. He felt it in the way she reacted whenever he mentioned college applications, her shoulders tensing, her smile freezing, her voice dropping as she whispered,
A college?
Far from me. How could you even think of leaving me after everything I gave up for you? The guilt that followed was heavy, suffocating. He stopped dreaming of moving away. Then he stopped dreaming at all. Eventually, even the neighbors began noticing the cracks behind the drawn curtains. They heard late-night arguments muffled, but unmistakably emotional. They heard Caleb crying quietly at times, then Evelyn's voice soothing him too softly, like trying to calm a child instead of an almost grown man. They assumed it was just a turbulent single-parent household. They had no idea they were hearing the early tremors of a psychological collapse. One December night, the power went out across the neighborhood during a winter storm. The entire block went dark except for the flicker of a candle glowing through Evelyn's curtains. That night became the turning point. Caleb later told investigators he had never seen his mother look so fragile. She sat on the floor beside him, candlelight trembling across her face, casting deep shadows under her eyes. She reached for his hand not like a mother comforting a frightened child, but like someone terrified of losing the last tether keeping her grounded. "I can't go back to being alone, Caleb," she whispered.
Promise you, LL stay with me. Promise you one, T leave no matter what.
He said yes. Because in the dim yellow glow, with rain slamming the windows, and the weight of her loneliness pressing on him like a second heartbeat, he didn't know how to say no. That was the night the boundaries dissolved for good, not in an explosive moment, not with violence or physical harm, but in a slow, emotional entanglement that grew into something the outside world would later call manipulation, coercion, and trauma bonding. Inside the townhouse, it felt like destiny. Outside, it looked like the beginning of a tragedy. And months later, when Evelyn would step through the courthouse doors with the entire city watching, everyone would wonder the same question. How could a mother's fear of abandonment twist itself into something that destroyed both lives? The first signs that something was deeply wrong began with small tremors, changes so subtle that most people dismissed them as the ordinary struggles of a stressed college senior. But with time, the tremors grew into cracks, and the cracks widened into something impossible to conceal. At Portland State University, where Caleb studied interior design, his professors were the first to notice. He stopped staying after class to ask questions, stopped volunteering to present his projects, stopped showing the quiet confidence that once made him stand out. His sketches became uneven. His lines shaky. Sometimes he would stare at the drafting table for minutes without touching his pencil, as if his mind were locked somewhere else entirely. When his advisor, Professor Linda Keaton, gently asked if everything was all right at home, Caleb forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just tired," he said.
Long semester.
But Linda had taught for 20 years. She knew the difference between exhaustion and distress. What she saw in Caleb was something else, something closer to emotional drowning. Meanwhile, Evelyn's control at home grew even tighter.
The escalation at home.
Every evening, she waited by the window for Caleb to come home from class, watching the street like a lighthouse keeper monitoring a storm. If he was even 10 minutes late, she texted repeatedly.
"Where are you?
Why aren't you answering?
Are you with someone? Do you want to leave me too?"
If he didn't respond fast enough, she would call, sometimes 12, 13, 14 times in a row. And when he walked through the door, she always acted relieved, breathless, almost panicked, wrapping her arms around him like someone greeting a soldier returning from war. There was no anger, just a terrifying level of dependence masked as affection. Evelyn began checking his pockets, his bags, his jacket sleeves. She insisted it was just to stay involved in your life. But Caleb knew better. This wasn't parental concern, it was surveillance disguised as care. By early spring, Evelyn had memorized his class schedule down to the minute. She demanded video calls whenever he stayed on campus after 6 p.m. And if he declined, she would go silent. Hours of pure silence. Not the normal quiet of a tired mother, but a weaponized stillness. Evelyn sitting on the couch with the lights off, staring into the hallway like a ghost waiting for him to explain himself. Caleb learned quickly, silence meant punishment. The first incident. One night, after a late group project meeting, Caleb returned home almost an hour after his usual time. The living room was dark. Only the faint blue glow of the kitchen nightlight spilled across the floor. Evelyn sat at the dining table, hands folded neatly, expression calm in a way that made his stomach twist. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I thought you were gone. I thought you decided I wasn't enough anymore." Caleb instinctively apologized even though he'd done nothing wrong. But his apology only opened the floodgates. Evelyn began recounting the night his father left the suitcase, the slammed door, the cold silence afterward. The more she spoke, the more her voice trembled. Then, like she'd crossed a point of no return, she stood, walked toward him slowly, and rested her forehead on his chest.
"Please don't leave me alone in this world, Caleb.
Promise me you won't become him." He didn't sleep that night. His mind replayed the moment over and over, feeling both suffocated and strangely responsible.
Neighbors take notice.
Soon, the neighbors began hearing the late-night emotional storms that shook the Hart household. The couple living next door, James and Martha Phelps, often heard muffled arguments. Caleb's frustrated voice, Evelyn's pleas, occasional thuds that sounded like overturned furniture.
One night, Martha heard crying.
Not loud crying, but soft, cracked sobbing, the kind that made her press a hand to her chest. She almost called the police but hesitated, afraid of misreading the situation. "Teenagers and single mothers," she told her husband, "it's probably just normal tension." But deep down, she knew it wasn't normal. Collapse at school. Everything escalated the morning Caleb collapsed at school. It was the first warm day after weeks of Oregon rain. Students spread across the campus quad, laughing, eating food truck burritos, enjoying the brief sunlight. Caleb was walking to his design studio when his vision blurred. His heart raced.
His hands shook uncontrollably.
He dropped his sketch tubes, stumbled, and collapsed onto the concrete pathway. A crowd formed instantly. Someone called campus security. A paramedic team rushed him into an ambulance. In the emergency room, doctors noticed unusual stress responses, elevated cortisol levels, signs of chronic sleep deprivation, and emotional trauma symptoms. When asked about his home life, Caleb stared at the ceiling with empty eyes and said the same line he always used. "Everything is fine." It was enough to make the physicians suspicious and enough to trigger a mandatory psychological evaluation.
The investigation begins.
The school contacted Evelyn. She arrived at the hospital within 20 minutes, breathless and frantic. But her reaction wasn't the typical fear or guilt of a mother worried for her son. It was possessive, almost territorial. She pressed her hands to Caleb's cheeks, whispering, "Don't talk to anyone without me. I'm here. I'm always here." Physicians exchanged uneasy looks. Something about her tone felt wrong, off-key, too intense. They gently asked Evelyn to step out so they could speak to Caleb privately. She refused. Completely refused, standing between them and the bed, shaking her head.
"No.
He doesn't need strangers filling his head with fear. I know what's best for my son." Her refusal triggered protocol. The hospital notified Adult Protective Services, the department that investigates domestic emotional abuse cases involving vulnerable adults.
Digging into the digital trail.
Investigators requested access to Caleb's academic performance, attendance logs, and eventually his university email standard procedure for suspected coercive control. What they found deepened their concern. Dozens of missed assignments. Long gaps with no replies to professors. Emails where Caleb apologized excessively. Late-night messages from Evelyn asking where he was. Calendar events mysteriously deleted. Several attempts from friends asking if he was okay, with no replies. When investigators questioned Caleb again, they noticed subtle signs of psychological trauma: hypervigilance, flinching at sudden sounds, apologizing for things that didn't require apologies. But the most chilling detail came from Evelyn's own phone records. She had called Caleb over 300 times in a single month.
The Oregon State Report.
A formal report was drafted. Its wording was clinical but terrifying. Subject: Caleb Hart exhibits indicators consistent with long-term emotional manipulation, dependency conditioning, and restricted autonomy.
Guardian: Evelyn Hart displays controlling behavior beyond normative caregiving.
It was the first official document that suggested this was far more than an unhealthy attachment. This was dependency engineered over years.
The final trigger.
The turning point came weeks later, when a school counselor found Caleb sitting alone in an empty stairwell, knees pulled to his chest, hands shaking. When she gently asked what was wrong, he whispered something she would never forget. "I just want to breathe without hurting her." It was the sentence that led to a full-scale intervention. Police wellness checks.
Psychiatric Evaluation.
Court-ordered interviews. A full investigation into Evelyn's household. And for the first time in 15 years, the walls of the Hart home, walls built from fear, guilt, and emotional chains, began to crack under the weight of the truth. Caleb didn't know it yet, but he was standing at the edge of an unraveling that would soon pull both him and his mother into a storm far larger than anything their quiet Portland street had ever imagined. The morning the police finally knocked on Evelyn Hart's front door, Portland was drenched in a steady gray drizzle, the kind of rain that swallowed sound and made the world feel distant. But inside the Hart townhouse, the atmosphere was sharper, tighter, trembling beneath a layer of feigned normalcy. Evelyn had been unusually cheerful that day. She cooked breakfast blueberry waffles, Caleb's childhood favorite, and hummed softly as if nothing in the world was wrong. She didn't mention the investigation. She didn't mention the school's mandatory reports. She didn't even mention the hospital's formal request to speak to Caleb alone. But her eyes were restless, darting toward Caleb every time he shifted in his chair.
Caleb barely ate.
His hands trembled so subtly that Evelyn reached out and held one, stroking his knuckles tenderly. "It's just stress, sweetheart. Everyone gets overwhelmed. You don't need strangers asking questions about our life." He nodded because nodding was easier than fighting. But deep inside, something cracked. He wasn't sure if it was fear, exhaustion, or the moment he finally accepted that his mother's version of love had swallowed the person he used to be. The home visit. When the knock came, it wasn't loud. It was soft, almost polite. 2 Portland police officers and a social services agent stood in the rain, jackets wet, expressions neutral but firm.
"Ms. Hart?
We're here for a wellness check requested by the hospital and the university. We just need a few minutes."
Evelyn froze just for a split second, but Caleb saw it.
It was the freeze of prey cornered unexpectedly. Then she smiled, that brittle, rehearsed smile she used at office meetings.
"Of course. Come in. I have nothing to hide."
But the truth was not as cooperative.
The living room interview.
The officers sat across from Evelyn and Caleb in the small living room, where family photographs lined the shelves, pictures of Caleb alone, always with Evelyn's hand somewhere on his shoulder. The social worker, Amanda Reyes, spoke calmly. "Caleb, we want to make sure you feel safe at home and that you have independence appropriate for your age." Evelyn's fingers tightened on Caleb's knee. "He feels safe. And we're very close. That's all." Amanda gave a small nod, but her eyes remained on Caleb. "Could we speak to you privately for a moment?" Evelyn's grip tightened further.
Caleb's breath hitched. No.
He doesn't need to be questioned like a criminal. He's my son. There's no danger here. Amanda's tone remained even.
Mom, it's standard procedure.
He's an adult. He has the right to speak alone.
The silence stretched.
Then Evelyn whispered, not loud enough for the officers, but loud enough for Caleb.
If you leave this room, you'll break my heart.
Again. Again. That word sliced through him like a razor. His father. The suitcase.
The slammed door.
The shadow he'd been raised to avoid becoming. I'm okay, Caleb said finally, voice cracking.
I'll talk.
Evelyn's hand fell away as if someone had pried her fingers off.
The private conversation.
In the dining area, away from Evelyn's eyes, Caleb sat stiffly at the table while Amanda took notes. Caleb, she asked gently, are you allowed to make decisions independently at home? About your schedule, your friends, your education? His throat tightened. He wanted to say yes, because that's what a good son would say. That's what a loyal son would say. That's what a son raised on guilt and devotion would say. But another part of him, the part that woke up shaking in the middle of the night, the part that begged silently for space, the part that once wrote in his journal, I just want air that isn't hers, knew he couldn't lie anymore. I don't know, he whispered. Sometimes I think I'm not allowed to have my own life. Amanda leaned in. Why do you feel that way? Because she doesn't want to be alone, Caleb said, eyes watering. She gets scared. She says I'm all she has. And when I try to pull back, she gets upset. She cries. She talks about my father. And then I feel like I'm supposed to stay. Amanda paused her pen. Her eyes softened. That's not your responsibility, Caleb. He looked at her with a fragile, confused expression like someone hearing a foreign language. For 18 years, he'd been told the opposite.
The document discovery.
As the private interview ended, one of the officers, walking through the hallway as part of the routine check, noticed something unusual on Evelyn's desk, an open file folder with neatly printed documents. At first glance, they looked like medical forms. But one page stood out.
A prenatal screening request.
Another form showed Evelyn's name.
And beneath it, Father, unknown, do not test.
The officer frowned and quietly gestured for Amanda to take a look. Her face drained of color. This wasn't normal. This wasn't even close to normal. In wellness checks, officers were instructed not to escalate unless they believed immediate danger existed. But this was something deeper. Something more alarming. Something that wasn't just emotional control, something that hinted at years of isolation, desperation, and psychological collapse. Amanda closed the folder gently and carried it to the living room.
Ms.
Hart, she said, voice slicing through the air, can you explain what these forms are?
Evelyn stiffened.
Her voice shook, barely noticeable, but enough.
Private medical documents.
None of your concern. Are you pregnant, Ms.
Hart?
Amanda asked carefully.
Something flickered behind Evelyn's eyes, fear, anger, then something worse, defiance.
I want all of you to leave, she said sharply. Right now. But it was too late. The investigation had already shifted from concern to alarm. Caleb's reaction. Caleb looked from the officers to his mother, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Mom, what is that? Why didn't you tell me?
Evelyn snapped, voice cracking like breaking glass. Because I can lose you.
Because people keep trying to take you away from me. Caleb went pale. For the first time, he saw her not as the fragile woman who needed him, not as the mother who survived years of abandonment, but as someone drowning in her own fear, pulling him under with her. The officers exchanged a look. This was no longer a wellness check. This was an emergency. The removal order. Amanda took a steady breath.
MS.
Heart, due to evidence of potential psychological endangerment, and until further evaluation, Caleb will temporarily relocate to a monitored residence. Evelyn's scream wasn't loud, wasn't even human. It was the sound of a life cracking open. You can't take him. He's mine. He's all I have. Officers stepped in as she lunged forward, not violently but desperately, reaching for Caleb like he was oxygen being stolen away.
Caleb stumbled back, heart racing.
Mom, please stop. Don't leave me, she whispered, collapsing to her knees. Don't you dare leave me like he did. Her voice faded into sobs. Caleb cried too, not because he hated her, but because he loved her in a way he didn't know how to untangle. In a way patterned from years of guilt, fear, and loyalty. The aftermath of the removal. As officers escorted Caleb out, Evelyn was restrained just enough to keep her from following, but not enough to harm her. She struggled, reaching out, begging, sobbing. Rain poured harder, soaking her hair, her clothes, her face. Neighbors watched from windows, confused and horrified. Caleb stepped into the squad car, shaking so badly he could barely breathe. He looked back only once through the blurred glass at the silhouette of his mother kneeling on the wet pavement, screaming his name as if her entire soul had been ripped out. He never forgot that image. And in that moment, he finally understood. This wasn't love. This was captivity disguised as devotion. This was a tragedy built slowly, quietly, behind closed doors. And it was only the beginning. The night Caleb was removed from the hot townhouse, Portland's rain didn't stop. It drummed against the police car roof as he sat in the back seat, staring at his trembling hands. The windshield wipers sliced through sheets of water, making the city blur like a watercolor painting smeared by grief. Beside him in the front passenger seat, social worker Amanda Reyes kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror, careful, gentle, but worried. He wasn't speaking. Not a single word since they'd left the house. He wasn't crying either. He looked hollow, like someone whose soul hadn't caught up to the rest of his body. When they arrived at the temporary residential Centera Clean, modern building partnered with Oregon's Adult Protective Services, Caleb didn't resist. He followed Amanda inside, signed intake forms with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking, and entered a small room with a bed, a desk, and a lamp that buzzed softly.
Before leaving, Amanda said softly,
"Caleb, tonight is the first night you get to breathe without guilt. It's going to hurt. But it's the beginning of healing, too." He nodded, though he wasn't sure if he understood.
He lay awake until dawn. Evelyn's arrest.
The next morning, Oregon State Police returned to the townhouse with a search warrant. Evelyn opened the door looking exhausted but composed. Her hair was tied neatly, her clothes pressed. It was as if she'd rehearsed this moment in her mind and decided the only way to survive was to appear unshakable.
MS.
"Hart," an officer said calmly, "we're here to execute a warrant regarding potential endangerment and falsified medical documents. Please step aside." She did. Silently. Without protest. Her eyes looked dead, two gray stones where warmth once lived. The officers searched. Her computer. A locked drawer in her bedroom. The desk folder containing prenatal paperwork. A small safe hidden behind old tax receipts.
Journals dating back 16 years.
A burner phone she kept in her bedroom closet. As items collected on the dining table, the room's atmosphere thickened with tension. Inside the locked drawer, they found what confirmed the investigators' worst suspicions.
A positive prenatal blood panel, 13 weeks pregnant. Evelyn Hart.
Age, 55. Risk category, extremely high. But it wasn't the pregnancy that rattled the officers. It was the test request Evelyn had submitted weeks earlier. Do not notify next of kin. Do not release paternal data. Request sealed profile. And then the page that cracked the case open. A private, unsigned letter she'd written but never mailed. Caleb, if they ever take you from me, they'll never touch our child. Not even the law can separate blood from blood. Amanda Reyes, who was present during the search, felt cold run down her spine. She knew immediately, whatever was happening here went far beyond emotional dependence. Evelyn was arrested the same afternoon.
Herr Demianor never changed, not panic, not fear, not anger.
Only a chilling calm, as if everything unfolding was merely an inconvenience in a long plan.
Caleb learns the truth.
2 days passed before Amanda was allowed to speak to Caleb again. During those 2 days, he barely slept. He paced his small room, stared at the wall, or sat curled on the bed, hands clasped so tightly they turned white. When Amanda finally entered, she hesitated before sitting.
Caleb, I need to tell you something. Something difficult.
He nodded slowly.
Amanda exhaled.
Your mother is pregnant.
Caleb blinked.
At first, he didn't register the words. Then his face crumpled not from guilt, but from shock so violent it looked like pain.
No, he whispered. No.
That can't be real.
She is 55.
She told me she couldn't, she said her doctor she. His breath hitched in his throat. Amanda placed a hand on the table, not touching him, but close enough to offer support. Caleb, we are still investigating how this happened. We aren't drawing conclusions. But the medical documents raise serious concerns. Caleb shook his head repeatedly. He looked young. Younger than 21. Younger than 15. Like a child cornered by a truth he wasn't ready to see. He whispered, She wouldn't hurt me." Amanda's voice softened. "Caleb, sometimes harm comes from people who believe they're protecting us. Your mother is not well. That doesn't make it your fault." He looked down at his hands. They were shaking again. "Is she going to prison?" "She's being evaluated at the state psychiatric facility first. The court will decide." For a long time, Caleb didn't speak. Then, barely audible, "Can I see her?" Amanda hesitated. "Not right now. Not until we complete your psychological assessment." He nodded. But she saw the devastation behind his eyes. The psychological evaluations begin. The next weeks were consumed by trauma-focused interviews, cognitive assessments, emotional stability tests, sleep pattern monitoring, memory recall sessions, home history analysis. Specialists concluded that Caleb showed signs of complex trauma, guilt-based conditioning, dependent identity formation, chronic emotional coercion, dissociative coping episodes. But the most alarming part was this. Caleb didn't perceive the coercion as coercion. He believed he'd chosen to stay. Trauma expert Dr. Harris wrote, "Subject exhibits a trauma bond so deeply rooted that he cannot distinguish personal choice from imposed obligation. His mother's emotional control has replaced his concept of autonomy." It wasn't victim blaming. It was the reality of someone raised inside a cage so gentle he never realized it closed behind him. Evelyn's interrogation. At the state psychiatric facility, Evelyn underwent evaluation too. The doctors quickly noted high-functioning delusional thinking, extreme attachment fixation, abandonment trauma dating back to her childhood, chronic obsessive-compulsive tendencies, Dissociation during emotional stress. Rigid, unshakable justification patterns. When asked why she forged documents or hid medical tests, she simply said, "I didn't want them twisting the truth." "What truth?" the psychiatrist asked. Evelyn looked directly at him with a softness that was almost frightening. "That Caleb belongs with me. That he was meant to stay. That we were meant to stay together. They don't understand love." She said the word love like it was a holy scripture she alone had decoded. When asked about the pregnancy, she only smiled faintly. Every mother has the right to keep her child, even if the world disagrees.
The investigative breakthrough.
3 weeks into the investigation, analysts discovered something chilling on Evelyn's old laptop. A collection of encrypted journal entries titled, "The Hart Household Principles." Inside were dozens of entries revealing Evelyn's fear Caleb would move out, her strategies to keep him dependent, her detailed notes on his emotional reactions, plans to create a world where he'll never leave again, her obsession with restoring the family unit, and the final entry, dated 2 months before the wellness check. "If he leaves, I will lose the only person who ever stayed. I'd rather die than face that again."
Amanda Rice cried quietly reading it.
Not out of pity but out of horror that this much psychological collapse had gone undetected for so long.
Caleb's breakthrough.
Weeks later, during an extended therapy session, Caleb finally cracked. A memory surfaced, one he'd buried for years. He remembered being 16.
A stormy night.
The electricity out. His mother crying, shaking, gripping his hands so tightly they hurt. And she whispered,
"You re all I have left. Promise you, LL never leave me. Promise me you, LL stay."
Caleb began sobbing, violent, painful sobs, because he suddenly realized something.
It wasn't a memory of love.
It was the moment she chained his future to hers.
The grand jury.
By the end of 2 months, the case reached the Multnomah County Courthouse. Prosecutors reviewed evidence.
Forged medical documents. Emotional coercion. Physical isolation.
Concealed pregnancy.
Dangerous mental instability.
Psychological manipulation spanning nearly a decade. And they prepared charges. But the hardest part, the most gut-wrenching, was asking Caleb to testify about years he no longer understood clearly. Amanda asked him gently, "Caleb, do you understand that you were a victim?" He didn't answer. He looked out the window instead, watching the Oregon rain fall steady, relentless, and cold. Then he whispered, "Can a victim still love the person who hurt them?" Amanda swallowed hard. "Yes," she said. "And that's exactly why it's so difficult." The stage is set. The indictment was filed. The courtroom date was set.
Evelyn Hart, 55.
Charged with
felony endangerment, emotional coercion, document falsification, psychological manipulation of a dependent adult.
The pregnancy remained the most explosive piece of evidence, so explosive that it was sealed from public access. But rumors leaked. And the city braced for a trial unlike anything they had ever witnessed. Caleb sat alone in his temporary housing room that night, staring at the wall, tears sliding silently down his cheeks. He whispered to the empty room, "Mom, why did you break us?" And in the distance, thunder rolled. The storm was only beginning. The morning of the pretrial hearing felt colder than any other day in Portland that year, though the temperature hadn't changed. The chill came from something deeper, from tension hanging over the city like fog refusing to lift. News vans lined the sidewalks around the Multnomah County Courthouse, their satellite dishes pointed toward a gray sky heavy with rain. Reporters whispered into microphones as if afraid to speak too loudly. The Evelyn Hart case moves forward today. Sources say the psychological evaluation is complete. A sealed report regarding a pregnancy. The son at the center of the case remains under protective supervision. Everyone wanted answers.
No one knew the full story.
Not yet. Inside the courthouse, the lighting was harsh, sterile. The hallways echoed with footsteps and murmurs. Security was unusually tight. Metal detectors, bag checks, and officers spaced every 20 feet. At the end of a long corridor stood Caleb, wearing a plain gray sweater, his posture small, his eyes withdrawn. He looked like someone who hadn't slept in weeks, and he hadn't. Every night since his removal, he woke with nightmares. His mother crying, his mother screaming, his mother staring at him with eyes full of desperation. Amanda Reyes stood beside him, hands clasped, watching him with maternal concern but careful not to touch him. Boundaries were essential now. "Caleb," she said softly, "remember, you don't have to testify today."
You only observing.
He nodded. But his throat tightened. Part of him wanted to run. Another part wanted to see his mother, needed to see her. To understand. To confront the impossible questions keeping him awake.
The courtroom.
When the doors opened, a wave of chatter rippled through the gallery. People craned their necks. Cameras clicked. Even journalists, usually hardened by grim stories, looked uneasy. For in the middle of the room, escorted by officers, wearing a beige psychiatric facility uniform and a blank expression, was Evelyn Hart. Her hands were cuffed. Her hair was tied back. Her face was drained of color. But her eyes, when they found Caleb, lit with a fierce, trembling devotion.
"Caleb," she whispered, lips barely moving.
"Baby." He froze. His breath hitched. A familiar urge to comfort her clawed up from somewhere deep inside, hymen instinct trained over years. But Amanda placed a gentle hand near his elbow, not touching, but enough to remind him that he was safe, that he didn't owe Evelyn anything today. Evelyn's gaze shifted, and something dark crossed her expression.
A flicker of hurt.
Then fear. Then something more dangerous, resolve. Prosecution reveals the evidence. The hearing began with the prosecutor, Daniel Whitmore, a tall man with sharp eyes and a voice that carried through the room even without a microphone. "Your Honor," he began, "the state intends to prove that Evelyn Hart engaged in long-term psychological manipulation, coercive control, and deliberate isolation of her son, Caleb Hart, leading to severe trauma and endangerment. We will show evidence including forged medical documents, encrypted journals, and a concealed pregnancy." A wave of gasps moved through the gallery. Evelyn didn't flinch. She simply looked at Caleb, as if asking him to ignore the world. The judge, an older woman with silver hair and a reputation for tolerance but no patience for manipulation, raised a hand.
"Ms.
Hart, you are not required to respond today. Remain silent unless spoken to." But Evelyn stood up anyway, slowly, shakily, like someone rising from underwater. "I didn't hurt my son," she said, voice fragile but firm. "I protected him. No one understands what loneliness does to a person. He was all I had. I didn't want to lose him ever again." The judge banged her gavel.
"Ms.
Hart, sit down." But Evelyn kept speaking, tears filling her eyes. "He was supposed to stay. He promised. When they took him, they took my reason to live." Officers gently forced her back into her seat.
Caleb trembled.
Hearing her voice hurt more than he expected. Because even now, even after everything, part of him still wanted to soothe her. And that terrified him. "The sealed report is unsealed." Judge Marwood cleared her throat, expression heavy. "There is a matter we must address today regarding the medical documents. The psychological team recommends limited unsealing to determine whether this pregnancy poses immediate legal and ethical concerns.
Evelyn closed her eyes.
Caleb's stomach dropped. A folder was handed to the judge. She opened it slowly. Her brows furrowed. Then she looked up directly at Evelyn.
MS. Hart, you are 16 weeks pregnant.
And according to the medical evaluation, the father is unidentified, but you refused all inquiries. The courtroom erupted. Whispers. Gasps. A shouted "No way" from the back. Evelyn's eyes darted wildly. Then they locked onto Caleb again. "Don't listen to them," she said, voice cracking. "They're twisting everything. Baby, please don't let them take this from us." Caleb felt like the room was spinning. His temples throbbed.
His hands trembled uncontrollably.
He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. He stood abruptly, knocking over his chair. Everyone turned. Reporters raised their cameras. "Caleb," Amanda whispered urgently, "you don't have to stay, let's step outside." But he shook his head. He looked at his mother across the courtroom, a woman whose life had been shaped by abandonment, fear, and a broken mind. "Mom," he whispered. Evelyn brightened instantly, tears streaming.
"Caleb, sweetheart, tell them.
Tell them we only had each other. Tell them this wasn't wrong." Her voice cracked in hysteria as officers tried to calm her. Caleb stared at her, heart breaking. I don't understand what happened anymore," he whispered, voice shaking. "I don't know what was love and what was control." Evelyn collapsed back into her seat with a sob. The court's decision. After nearly an hour of arguments between prosecution and medical experts, the judge announced, "Given the psychiatric evaluations, the concealed pregnancy, and the risk of further psychological harm to the victim, the court orders the following. Evelyn Hart will remain at the State Psychiatric Center under maximum supervision. The pregnancy will be monitored by independent medical personnel. All contact with Caleb Hart is prohibited until further notice. A full criminal trial is scheduled in 6 weeks. All case details are sealed from public release due to the sensitive nature of the victim's trauma." Evelyn didn't scream this time. She didn't fight. She simply stared at Caleb with a broken, glassy expression like someone watching their entire world dissolve.
Caleb breaks down.
When court adjourned, Caleb stepped into the hallway and collapsed onto a bench, burying his face in his hands. His sobs were quiet, but raw, shaking his entire body. "Why did she do this?" he choked out. "Why did she ruin everything? Why wasn't I enough the way things were?" Amanda sat next to him, not touching, but close.
"Caleb," she said softly, "your mother wasn't living in reality.
Her love was twisted by fear. That's not your fault. It never was." "But I still love her," he whispered, voice shaking. "What kind of person does that make me?" "A human one," Amanda answered gently.
Trauma doesn't erase love.
And love doesn't erase trauma. You can feel both. It doesn't make you weak, it makes you honest."
Caleb cried harder.
Because deep down he knew the truth. He wasn't mourning the mother he had. He was mourning the mother he never got to have. Evelyn's final act in the hearing room. As officers escorted her through a side hallway, Evelyn looked strangely peaceful, almost serene. She turned once, glancing back at the courtroom door, and whispered to herself,
"Caleb will come back.
He always comes back. He promised." And with that, she disappeared behind the heavy steel doors. An unexpected letter. Hours later, as Caleb sat alone in his residential room, a staff member slipped a sealed envelope under his door.
No return address.
Just his name, written neatly. He opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a single line. If the world takes you from me, I will find a way back. Mom. Caleb stared at it for a long time. Then he whispered to the empty room, "Please don't." But deep inside he knew. The trial might end soon. But this trauma,
this invisible chain,
would take years to unravel.
And the hardest part still lay ahead.
6 weeks passed, slow as dripping water wearing down stone. Caleb lived each day inside a routine designed to help him recover. Therapy sessions, group meetings, supervised classes, quiet afternoons spent sketching in the sunlit courtyard of the residential center. From the outside, he looked stable. Inside, he was unraveling thread by thread. Every night, he dreamed of his mother's voice whispering, pleading, crying. And every morning, he woke with the same hollow question clawing at his ribs. Why wasn't love enough to keep her from breaking me? But no therapist could answer that. And no amount of reasoning could make the trauma smaller. The rumors begin. Despite the case being sealed, leaked fragments spread through the community. Whispers of a pregnancy. Rumors of manipulation. Speculation about Caleb's role. Strangers online claiming to know the truth.
Podcasts inviting experts to analyze the heart tragedy.
Some people cast Caleb as a victim. Others cast him as complicit. Others called Evelyn a monster. And a few insisted she was just a broken woman failed by society. None of them knew the actual truth. None of them knew how deep the psychological scars went. None of them knew that Caleb had to relearn what freedom felt like just to get through the day.
The day of the trial.
When the trial finally began, Portland's rain returned, pouring so heavily it blurred the courthouse steps into gray sheets of water. Another wall of news vans lined the curb, reporters clutching umbrellas and broadcasting into microphones with somber voices. Today marks the formal proceedings in the Evelyn Hart trial. The son, Caleb, is expected to remain protected and will not testify publicly. Inside, the courtroom was tense, clammy with humidity and dread. Caleb sat in a private viewing room behind one-way glass. He could see everything in the courtroom. But no one could see him. His fingers dug into the armrests as he watched officers bring Evelyn in. She wore a navy blue prison-issued uniform this time. Her wrists were chained lightly in front of her. Her stomach showed a subtle curve. 16 weeks now, perhaps 17. Her expression flickered between calm and terror. But when she sat down and glanced toward the public gallery, Caleb felt something twist in his chest. Even though she couldn't see him, he saw the way she searched for him, eyes scanning the benches, desperate, hungry, hopeful. She expected him to come. Part of her still believed he would. Opening statements. The prosecutor spoke first, presenting a narrative built on months of investigation. Evelyn Hart systematically isolated, emotionally manipulated, and psychologically conditioned her son for over a decade. She restricted his autonomy, coerced dependency, and created a closed environment where he could not distinguish personal freedom from maternal control. She forged medical documents, concealed a pregnancy, and refused psychiatric intervention. The courtroom was silent. People leaned forward, afraid to miss a word. The defense attorney, a man appointed by the state after Evelyn declined representation, spoke next.
Mrs.
Hart suffers from untreated mental illness, abandonment trauma, and delusional thinking. She requires psychiatric care, not condemnation. Her actions were not born from malice but from a broken mind that could not cope with loss. Caleb's throat tightened. Hearing both sides was like watching two worlds argue over his life. One world insisting he had been victimized. The other insisting she hadn't meant to hurt him. Both worlds were true. And neither world could fully explain the complicated love he still felt for her. The evidence unfolds. For 2 days, evidence was laid bare. Evelyn's journals, encrypted files, surveillance logs, text messages, medical evaluations, psychological analyses, interviews with neighbors, reports from Caleb's university,
and then the hardest evidence of all, the prenatal medical file.
When the judge allowed limited unsealing, the courtroom gasped again. Evelyn looked down at her stomach with trembling hands. Then she whispered to herself, "Everything I did for us." The specialist's testimony.
Dr.
Harris, the trauma specialist who evaluated Caleb, took the stand. His voice was steady, his words clinical yet compassionate. Caleb exhibits signs of severe trauma bonding. This occurs when a victim becomes emotionally attached to their controller despite the harm done. He shows guilt-based dependency, fear-conditioned loyalty, and chronic confusion between affection and coercion. The judge nodded gravely. "And in your professional opinion," she asked, "was Caleb capable of giving free consent or exercising autonomy during the period in question?" "No, Dr. Harris replied firmly. His mother's control prevented that."
A quiet, piercing sob echoed through the courtroom.
It was Evelyn.
Evelyn Takes stand.
Despite her attorney's advice, Evelyn insisted on testifying. She walked to the stand trembling, shoulders hunched, hands gripping the rail. But when she sat and faced the courtroom, her eyes softened as if she were looking at her younger self in a mirror. "Caleb saved my life," she began, voice small but clear. "When his father left, I thought the world ended. Caleb was the only light I had left. I raised him alone. I kept him safe. I gave him everything I had even when I had nothing." Her chin quivered. "I know I kept him close," she continued, tears forming. "I know I needed him too much. But needing someone isn't a crime. Loving someone so deeply you can't breathe without them, that isn't a crime. He was mine. My boy. My heart." She pressed a shaking hand against her stomach. "And this child is my hope. My future.
The one thing they can take away from me."
The prosecutor rose.
Ms.
Hart, did you manipulate your son emotionally? Did you isolate him to keep him from growing independent? Evelyn shook her head violently.
"No.
I protected him.
The world is cruel.
People leave.
They break you. They abandon you.
Did you allow him privacy? Not when it put him at risk. Did you restrict his social life? He didn't need anyone but me."
Ms.
Hart, the prosecutor said quietly, "do you understand that statements like that are the very definition of coercive control?" Her jaw clenched. "I loved him."
"And do you believe love justifies harm?"
She lifted her chin. "It's not harm when it's love."
A chill spread through the courtroom.
Even the judge looked shaken. The verdict. After 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. People held their breath. Caleb pressed a fist to his mouth behind the one-way glass. The foreperson stood. For the charge of felony endangerment. Guilty. For the charge of prolonged psychological coercion. Guilty. For the charge of falsifying medical documents. Guilty. For the charge of reckless disregard for mental health safety. Guilty. Evelyn sagged backward as if the words physically struck her. Her attorney steadied her, but she shook him off, staring straight ahead, whispering,
No, Caleb, you promised."
The sentencing. Judge Marwood's voice was unwavering.
Ms.
Hart, given the severity of the emotional damage inflicted, the documented coercive control, the concealed pregnancy, and the psychological risk to both your son and the unborn child, this court sentences you to 12 years in a state psychiatric prison facility. Mandatory treatment.
No parole.
No contact with Caleb Hart until deemed medically appropriate. Supervised handling of your pregnancy. And finally, the court will appoint guardianship for the unborn child pending evaluation.
Evelyn gasped a raw, animal sound.
Her hands flew to her stomach.
No. Please. Don't take my baby. Don't take my last.
Officers moved quickly as she broke down, sobbing so violently it shook her entire body.
Caleb stared through the glass, devastated, torn apart from the inside.
He wasn't crying. He wasn't breathing. He was breaking in silence.
After the verdict.
When the room cleared, Amanda found him sitting on the floor, back against the wall, hands limp.
Caleb, she whispered, are you all right?
He shook his head. I feel like I lost her twice, he said. Once as a mom and once as a person. Amanda sat beside him. She was sick, she said gently. Sick people can love deeply and still cause immense harm. Caleb closed his eyes. She's going to hate me forever.
No, Amanda said softly.
She's going to heal.
And so will you.
He didn't answer. He couldn't.
The finale scene.
3 months later, on a quiet autumn afternoon, Caleb walked alone across the St. John's Bridge.
Leaves swirled in the wind.
The Willamette River glistened below. He held a letter in his hand, the last one Evelyn had been allowed to send. He unfolded it slowly. Caleb, I don't understand why you turned away. But I forgive you.
Vonde, my bull forgive ml to.
Mom. He read the words again. And again. Then he folded the letter, placed it gently in his jacket pocket, and whispered into the wind.
I don't hate you.
I'm just learning how to exist without your shadow. A single tear slipped down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. Because for the first time in his life, the tear belonged to him, not to her. And that was the beginning of freedom.